with the arts community at the university to many, many different ways. One of the ways is to nominate and help give awards to alumni for their professional, societal, and institutional contributions that bring honor to the University of Chicago. Believe me, given the high bar there, it's a pretty hard thing to do, to find someone who goes above that bar. Mr. Selz, who was a professor of Emeritus in modern art at the University of California at Berkeley, he received his MA here in 1949 and his PhD in 1955, both in art history, and is one of the award recipients this year. Mr. Selz couldn't join us this weekend. However, he will be recognized at the 73rd Annual Awards Ceremony tomorrow at Rockefeller Chapel at 10:30 a.m. I'll be there on time. I hope you will join. I hope you guys can make it over tomorrow. It's fun to sit in Rockefeller and listen and watch as people get their awards, and as Mr. Zimmer and the whole community do that for us. Today, we're joined by Mr. Selz's daughter, Gabrielle, who was nice enough to grace us with her attendance and flying from New York. And she's a writer and live storyteller. Selz is published in the New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, and writes art reviews for the Huffington Post. Most recently, she published a book called Unstill Life, which will be for sale soon, after this, which you'll hear more about throughout today's comments, throughout today's discussion. Selz is joined by art historians and U of C faculty members, Christine Mehring and Reinhold Heller. Ms. Mehring, if I did correct that, is the department chair professor of art history and in the college, and Mr. Heller is professor emeritus in art history, Germanic studies, and the committee on the visual arts and in the college. Mr. Heller counts Mr. Selz as a dear friend, and so without further ado, I'm going to hand over the discussion to Mr. Heller, who will be our kickoff speaker. Thank you folks so much for coming.
Thank you. My memories of Peter Selz go back to 1965, which is when I first met him, and he was at that time curator at the Museum of Modern Art. It was just before he left MoMA. I was a graduate student at Indiana University looking for a dissertation topic, and I was very interested in German Expressionism. Peter Selz wrote a dissertation on German Expressionism here at the University of Chicago, completed his PhD in 1954. It was both the first dissertation on German Expressionism and a few years later the first book, serious scholarly book on German Expressionism. One of the first dissertations on modern art generally. Peter was extraordinarily helpful for me in guiding my own search for a dissertation topic, which ultimately landed on Edvard Munch, sort of precursor of Expressionism. But in the years that I've known Peter, we've often talked about, especially after I came to join the faculty here, talked about his time here at the university, which he came to the University of Chicago immediately after the Second World War, after he was discharged from the Army. And he joined a department here that was intriguingly made up largely of German refugees. So Peter, a German refugee himself, he left Germany in the late 1930s, joined a department of other German refugees, and he has intriguing stories to tell about that. But it's also a period in the history of the department that I think has been very little investigated. This period of the late 40s, early 50s, which the German refugees were the dominant faculty here. Peter went on then to the Museum of Modern Art, went to different other, taught at Pomona College, and was major curator at the Museum of Modern Art, where he organized a whole series of exhibitions that I think largely shaped my own ideas about what art history is. Exhibitions that went counter to the dominant abstraction doctrines of the time. He created the exhibition of the New Images of Man, which was devoted to figurative images rather than abstract images. He brought Jean Tinguely's homage to New York, the machine that destroyed itself in the garden. He organized a Rodin exhibition, and these are all firsts. There hadn't been such exhibitions previously in the United States. A Rodin exhibition, a Giacometti exhibition, a Dubuffet exhibition, a Rothko exhibition, and various others.
Yeah, Arnie too.
So has he ever talked to you much about Chicago?
A little bit, yeah, and I actually, and after, when we're later on, I'm going to read a statement he wrote about it, but my parents met here too, which is, my mom was getting her master's and graduated from here in English. But it was a really important time for him, and you know, it wasn't just that there were so many German refugees also in Chicago, but also at the Institute of Design. So it was an amazing period, and it really kind of was a refuge for him. It was a home for him. It was where he really learned to think and to really be engaged with art that was happening now, art that was happening all around him, to be engaged in conversations with his professors, to really stretch himself and prove himself. Because when he left Germany, he left everything behind, and it wasn't really until he landed here that he began to feel his life coming back. So, and I'll talk about that, but I think we were going to show the film first. Do you want me to introduce it? Okay. I made this, I wrote a memoir about my life with my father and growing up in the art world and what it was like to be part of that from a, you know, it's not from a child's point of view, but from an outsider, a little bit outsider, insider point of view. And in the process, I had written a draft, and I had this premonition about my dad that, you know, he might not still be around when my book was done, and I wanted people to see him in this environment, have the experience I had growing up, and you know, his contagious energy when he talks about art and his passion for it. So I made this very short 8-minute film. I actually had no idea. All I knew was that I loved the Civil War documentaries, and I wanted to have talking heads interspersed with images. And I wanted to do it in his home where he was surrounded by his art. And that's all I told him. I don't think I even told him I was going to put in other pictures of other things. And I would just sit across from him, and somebody was filming it, and ask him a series of questions. And my dad loves to talk and to hold forth, and so he was a natural. And so we're going to show the film, and I'll tell you a little bit more afterwards.
It came the moment in 1958. I had certain ideas what I wanted to do. These ideas were not at all traditional. In the controversial field of contemporary art, I carried this further. Tradition of the Museum of Modern Art from its very beginning. Many artists, I really gave them their start in the art world. I was in charge of painting and sculpture exhibitions. I showed them, I exhibited them, I wrote about them.
My dad always was interested in change and movement. He was a restless man. There's always a sense of possibility with my father. He'll decide he wants to do something, and he'll go off and do it.
So intently wanted to do a self-destructive work of art. The idea was, philosophically, that nothing is permanent. About 9 months earlier, before I came to MoMA, there had been a very serious fire. Great money lily upon the triptychs was burned up. I said, okay, we'll do it as an exhibition.
And then they had the night of the event. About 200 people gathered in the garden. Tingley turned on the machine.
The thing began to start, and it started in all different directions. There's balloons and words coming out, and things falling apart. An upright piano started to break into flames.
And then the fire happened.
He never told me about the fire. He was a sneaky bastard. My boss at the museum wouldn't even talk to me. So we were really worried that night. Soon after my beginning at MoMA, this made the end of my time there. But the next day, he was very much vindicated by the press.
The Times had dubbed him Mr. Modern Art.
I felt I could really do what I wanted to do and be successful in doing it.
At that point, he could do no wrong. he had the life that he never thought was possible.
My passion for art really started when I was a kid in Munich. My grandfather was an art dealer, and he took me to a major museum of old master paintings, Rubens's and Rembrandt's and Dürer's. And if things had happened differently in Germany, I probably would have taken over his art business at one time. Of course, that didn't happen that way. Things fell apart.
Growing up as a Jew in Germany and being forbidden to go to school and forbidden to work and having all these rules, and then leaving that world and having the world open up for you. 17, and you're on a boat and you see the New York skyline. It must have felt extraordinary freedom. I can remake my life. He could have anything he wanted. He's answerable only to himself. At that time, in that place in New York, the whole art world was willing to take more risks. Tanya and I were little kids growing up in that world. We had an apartment on Central Park West. You could look out across the park and you could see the Guggenheim, which was just beginning to be built. I have all these journals and letters from my mother. She goes, I'm in love with New York, and all the glamorous parties and dressing up, and how, you know, she had to figure out what she drank so she wouldn't get too drunk. And she would say, you know, I'm only allowed a scotch, and then I can have wine later on in the night.
So it was a very, very active, almost too active a social life. But that was very much part of the world.
Art was really exciting. They were taking the art off the wall and they were just, you know, doing these grand things.
There was this big fight going on. The figurative artist wouldn't talk to the abstract artist, and the abstract not to the figure. There was a real total division in the New York art world. I was free to do what I wanted to do. I mean, I made it very clear from the very beginning when I took this job that the exhibition we were going to do were decided by me, the head of that department. And here I had two shows, almost at the same time, of a major figurative artist, Jean Dubuffet, and a major abstract artist from America. I felt very strongly that art has many faces, that there are many different aspects to art at any one time.
There were not that many kids in the art world. Most of those artists were very focused on their arts, and they didn't have room in their lives for children. There was art going on everywhere you turned, in every corner. The pictures on the walls were so much a part of our life. They weren't just background, they were foreground. And in many ways, the children and the life was background. The boundaries were all broken down, and I think that they weren't only broken down in the art, but they were broken down in our home life.
I was very much dedicated to my career, I have to admit that, and that certainly did not have necessarily a positive experience on my family life.
My way of connecting to my father was through art, and Dad would take me to look at art. And we used to play this game where I would walk into a gallery with him and I would call out the names of everything I knew. When you get him in front of a piece of art, he starts getting excited and talking about art. He comes alive and he makes an emotional connection that he often doesn't make.
When I look at a work of art, different as they may be, I get a new experience. Not only about art and about painting, but about the human condition. A fast-moving, self-destroying piece by Sean Tingley, or a totally silent tablet by Mark Roscoe, they deal with the human condition. This is what I respond to. People don't realize anymore that for many, many years, the Museum of Modern Art was a center of controversy. Now it has become a boring part of the establishment. And there was always anti-establishment in the whole career.
His idea of complete freedom within marriage pulled them apart. He got addicted to starting over, so he's great at beginnings. That's why he's gotten married 5 times. I mean, there's always that sense of possibility.
It was too much of the same thing all the time. And Mona had, in a way, done the major things I had wanted to do. Every day I picked up the paper, and there was all this stuff going on, the free speech movement here in Berkeley. And it seemed to me that'd be very exciting for me to be part of this, to be involved in certain radical changes. They offered me to start this new museum on the Berkeley campus.
He wanted to go on a new adventure and go off to California, and my mother didn't want to go on a new adventure. She was done with adventure of that kind. And Berkeley, California, at the late 60s was the perfect place for him to express himself and to have no boundaries. Art is about going on an adventure. It can continue to bleed. You can keep going. But when you go too far in life, it dissipates, it loses its impact, it stops being meaningful. You need actually a container and a frame for meaning.
Thanks. Yeah, I had some really great people working with me who I didn't even know. I hired them because I liked the name of their company. Like, you like the name of a book and you buy it. The company was called Stories Matter. And I feel that's true. I feel that's true also about the story of art. But I want to say something about my dad and coming to Chicago. He was denied an education. That was why his family, his mother actually had the forethought to get her kids out of Germany. And she wanted my dad to continue his education. And he had 1 year when he got to America before he then had to go to work. Because his parents were, through this long ordeal, were able to get out of Germany. And he had to support them. So when he got to Chicago, it was, he got this thing that had been taken away from him. And so it was so important for him to feel embraced and to come into this world. And he talks about how, in the evenings they would go to this place called Jimmy's Bar. Is they still there? I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And he said that there was this encyclopedia, and they would have these big discussions. They'd pull it down and check the encyclopedia. And so it was his, morning, noon, and night world. And then I also wanted to say something too. If you're looking at that film, there's a moment when it pans what I call the row, or he actually calls it the row of heads in his, there's in St. Louis at that point. And he knew some of the other artists he was writing about at that time. Then he wanted to say, I'm going to read you a little bit of what he said. There were at least 2 additional University of Chicago professors of great consequence. John U. Neff, who founded and directed the Committee of Social Thought, right? You're nodding your head.
Well, he also, the family has endowed a chair for art and visual culture within the Committee of Social Thought, so it's nice that
he brought these intellectuals and artists of great distinction like Marc Chagall, T.S. Eliot, Jacques Martin, Camus, and so my dad heard these people. And he also took a great interest in his work. And then there was Joshua C. Taylor, who joined the art history department and became his advisor and lifelong friend and associate. And in 1961, when my dad was at MoMA and he curated the new images, the Italian Futurism show, he had Taylor write a catalog essay, and they traveled to Italy together. And then when he was in Berkeley, he had Taylor write an essay of American spiritual art called Pen the Spirit. And then I also had to remind my dad that, my dad was always fascinated by primal texts. And going back to the source and engagement with, what the artist actually wrote about their work and thought about their work. And this was something that he had also attributed to his time in Chicago, because when he first got to Chicago, he had to pass all these exams, and he flunked his biological science exam. And so he was put in this class, and they were forced to read, or not forced to read, they got to read Darwin. Not writing about Darwin, but the original text. And he says, that not only did he find him a great scientist, but he was just such an amazing writer, and was so incredible for him to actually deal with the original source material. And I say that because later on, my dad continued to have conversations with Joshua Taylor and Herschel Chip, which I think was a student of Taylor's too, might be. So they all got together and they came up with this idea of compiling a publication of primary source documents, which turned into Theories of Modern Art, a source book of artists and critics, which is, this is an anthology of writings and statements by artists that's indispensable to the understanding of visual arts. And I run into people now, and there's like 3 different versions of it now. Like
I still use it for my 20th
yeah,
century.
I run into people now, and like, and not just teachers, but also students, everybody. I had it when I was studying art history. So that was all from this continuous engagement with professors that he had at Chicago. And that when he later became a teacher in Berkeley, he was really, he worked with students. One of his former students, Christine Stiles, actually did the book, The Theories of Documents in Contemporary Art with him, Dr. Stiles. And there were always, I remember, their house was always full of his students. They would come over, they would get to have dinner with this professor and this guy who had been at MoMA. It was like touching the source, and sit in his house with all this art around them, which is, again, why I wanted to capture that environment. And for a young student to come there and to see, you could have this life, or you could be engaged in it, and then to interact with him and have them, invite them over and really open up his life to them was incredible.
What was it like making this film with him and about him? To what degree did you make it with him?
I told him what to do.
And did he do it?
He was really good, and yeah, he was very good. He knew it was about him, so he was very, very flattered. We made it only 3 years ago. He was in better shape at that point. And we made it in, literally 3 hours. I mean, just the filming of the B-roll of him talking. And then I cut in the images that I had picked out. And it was wonderful to sit down with him with the photographs, too, and have him talk about the photographs. There's a photograph of, when you see the museum in Germany, the next photograph is this sort of ornate Bavarian, or house in Munich. That was his grandfather's house, this house that took up a city block. And then to see my dad at that 17 getting on the boat, that was the picture that, of him. It's very emotional. But yeah, he really enjoyed it, and, he just enjoyed walking around the house, and it felt very natural.
I was, especially because, really, I think his importance in terms of beginning to work on what still was contemporary art.
Right.
I mean, the German expressionist artists were to some degree still artists that he had met, or then later on met and talked with. And to sort of make a film about him as to some degree, historical figure, but still, obviously very much alive and working until very late in his life with contemporary artists. It's always an interesting tension.
Yeah, yeah, and he continued to work with, contemporary artists. I mean, he was always, when he came to Berkeley especially, although Tingley, again, he was something that who was, doing stuff around, and nobody wanted to do the Tingley exhibit in the MoMA Sculpture Garden. They kept telling my dad, we're in the business of selling art, not destroying it. And
I think this sort of phenomenon of you have to work on dead artists, it really strikes a chord with me, because I left Germany myself because that's what I was told when I wanted to study post-war art. And here in the US it was possible, largely thanks to the sort of legacy of your dad to some degree, I suppose. But I always felt that kind of working on artists that are still alive and working on a world of art that one actually shares, it's a treasure trove for a historian.
Right.
Because you actually get to talk to people rather than just read the documents. You get to shape the creation of history in a way. Was that?
I think, I think very much so. I mean, my dad loves to be the first one on the scene. And he's smiling, he had very close relationships with some of these artists, Dan Francis, Christo, and in some ways, I mean, you hear him say, I was the one that gave them their start, So yeah, I think he likes to credit himself with discovering somebody and helping launch their career, but more than that, just being the first, being the first to notice this thing, being the first to really pay attention to it. And I think that comes from having a really restless nature too, always wanting to go on to the next thing.
We stress the sort of importance of him for working on contemporary artists, but I think what I wanted to stress too, and especially given that he's so important for German art, I think what one has to expand that in terms of the sort of importance for him in bringing a kind of geographic breadth to modern art. German expression is really, I mean, he was beginning to work on this at a moment when the center of the art world had shifted from Paris to New York. And so when he came to the Museum of Modern Art, New York really was the place of a kind of canon of 20th century art as it was emergent, as the story was being told at the Museum of Modern Art that started in Europe and then shifted to the US. And just at that very moment, he's looking back to Europe. He's doing a show on Polish artists. He's doing a show of Dubuffet. He's bringing Tanguy. This is all art that no one wanted anything to do with at that moment in New York.
Right. This is very true, and a lot of, and even the New York artists, like when he did New Images of Man, they're like, what? Like, he put in Leon Golub from Chicago, and it's like, you know, this was the hinterland, and he included people in California, and then a few English artists. So yeah, he always did that, and he had a big scope.
Interesting that you mentioned the term hinterland, because I think he sometimes seems to have talked about this also in terms of sort of regional art and the importance of regional art. But for someone working today, and for many of us today, I think there's a way in which what used to be called regional, now we're talking about in terms of global art, right?
Right.
That's basically not the same. We're phrasing it in a different way. But it's interesting for me to sort of think of him as a kind of pioneer in terms of, you know, all the kind of non-Western art. I mean, he never looked, I think, beyond Europe and the US. It wasn't really possible then, but it's the start of that.
Yeah, my dad always said that the art world, that there's not one mainstream. In fact, his collection of essays is beyond the mainstream. He felt that the art world had many tributaries, and that's a word he uses a lot, and so he really wanted people to look at the tributaries and how it all, you know, it kind of feeds in, but it also branches out.
I wonder, maybe we'll shift a little bit to talking about the kind of California context. So in Pomona, and then going back again to the Bay Area to found the museum. He was the founding director of the Berkeley Art Museum. There's something, I think he's talking about California as being so wonderfully open.
Well, it was a very radical time. I mean, he got there in '66, I think. And, you know, the free speech movement had started. Of course, unfortunately, as soon as my dad got to Berkeley, Reagan was shortly thereafter elected governor and cut the funds for the Berkeley Museum. But it was a really interesting time. There were quite a lot of Europeans and former refugees in California. I mean, Walter Mehring was there.
Walter Mehring, Schönberg.
Schönberg,
Thomas Mann.
Yeah, I think. What do you think appealed to them about that area? It was beautiful.
It was a beautiful area.
Yeah.
Many of them came because of connections with Hollywood.
Yes, that's true. That's true. But Dad was in Northern California.
But he went to Pomona earlier, and I think he's connecting with Schönberg and kind of some of the new music figures there.
Yeah, he did the Schönberg Festival. I was taught to one when I was a kid. He went to Pomona. This is when he started out his career, and you know, you had asked me a question about like what advice he would give to young art historians if people graduating at this point. And my dad said he was so persistent, he couldn't get a job, and he went around, you know, after he graduated, he basically went door to door with his dissertation. And you know, he was offered this wonderful position in Pomona, and it was really beautiful. And they thought, well, we'll raise our kids here, and he got to direct the gallery there. And then he decided he always wanted to bring something outside that area into that area. So when he was at Pomona, he wanted to bring the Stieglitz Circle into Pomona, which actually brought him back to New York and facilitated his job, getting a job at MoMA. And then when he was at MoMA, he wanted to show, you know, California art. He included California artists in the New Images of Man show. He really hated the fact that, you know, these islands were isolated from each other.
And another aspect that I thought I would stress, because it also connects back to some of the art exhibitions and media that he worked with then in the Bay Area later. But already earlier, the art of assemblage at MoMA, I think, was an exhibition that really the importance of it cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
So geographic breadth, the contemporary, but then also the media diversity. If you think about the 20th century, I mean, all of you probably have some sense of this sort of sheer explosion of all the types of materials that suddenly are valid materials for art making. And Peter Selz really was one of the people who began to acknowledge that, and began to collect this kind of art that was very, and still remains in many ways, very controversial. So assemblage art, art that is made out of all sorts of different materials that might have an eagle, a stuffed eagle incorporated in, let's say. The thing about ceramics to support Peter Volkas.
Also Peter Volkas, a good friend.
Kinetic art, art that actually moves,
Memoir.
has engines part of it, tangly, that lie, exactly. Then also his Art Nouveau show, bringing design in and kind of breaking down that distinction.
But that was, you know, he felt that Art Nouveau really influenced the early parts of modern art, and he wanted to show that. He wanted to show where modern art, he was at the Museum of Modern Art, so he wanted to show them.
That was a extraordinarily controversial position at that time.
To bring in Art
Bringing in
Nouveau.
Art Nouveau, which was still pretty much rejected, and
Yeah,
denigrated and ridiculed.
I know, and
He, through the exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, did see it as a kind of fountainhead of the developments of the 20th century. So totally contrary to the standard art historical doctrines of the time. And it seems to me that throughout his life, he has loved to take on these
he
kinds
does
of
like
contrary
challenges.
positions.
Yeah, very controversial positions. The Art Nouveau show, by the way, was the first show at the MoMA that was just that, you know, all the departments were involved. So the design department and the furniture department and, you know, the art, had all been separated. It was the first time they all came together.
And they still are separate, yet with
Right.
this kind of art, you really need to work across.
Yeah, and the other thing he did at Berkeley, which was a lasting impact, was he was the one who insisted on there having the Pacific Film Archive, because he saw film as an art form. And this is what he had taken back from MoMA, because MoMA had this amazing, you know, film department. And so Pacific Film Archive is now one of the great, you know, film archives in the world, I think.
Might your mother's interest in film have influence?
I don't know. Yeah, my mother early on was interested and would write film reviews. You know, I don't know. I should ask him. She taught a little bit of film. My mom was a writer and an English teacher. She wrote beautiful short stories. And my book is actually what's wonderful was the most interesting thing besides talking to my dad was being able to include her journals. She kept journals during their time in New York, and so I have these like original source materials. Go back to my dad. You know, I'm able to incorporate these original source materials into the book, and so you really see this woman arriving and what it was like to like walk into a party and have all the boys there, all these abstract expressionists, and that was wonderful. But yeah, I should ask him. I had never made that connection. That's an interesting thought.
Speaking of writing and publication, though, it's interesting. I think I remember that he's beginning to support the sort of beginnings of the Pacific Film Archive with parts of his museum budget that were reserved for publications.
Right.
Because there was no one who was going to support the film archive. It was really something that was unheard of, that museums would collect films outside of the Museum of Modern Art.
Yeah, and now, of course, it's day or day, you know. But it wasn't that. And then he, you know, went on to do other things. Like he was involved. He was a project director for Christo's Running Fence. And so he would really get, again, directly, and that he loved because of the politics involved with that. My dad had a passion for any kind of art that was, again, controversial or political or, you know, engaged the world. And the Running Fence, and like, as most of Christo's projects are, you know, there are millions of court dates. You have to get all these permits. It requires the collaboration of many institutions. And my dad just ate that stuff.
Speaking of controversial things, so when the museum opens, the construction of which and the design of which he's overseeing as the first director at Berkeley, he has Anna Helprin, a kind of really big new dance performance artist.
People, and those weren't just regular naked people.
She proposed to do a performance on the steps of the museum, right?
Yeah,
Can you talk
no,
a little about
actually, in the it wasn't Round but in the central space of the museum, she wanted to do this naked dancers rolling around and christening, what was it, soft flesh on hard concrete. Basically christen the museum with people's flesh. And, you know, again, the regions of California weren't too thrilled with that idea, but my father stood up and said, "It's the People's Museum. It's not because I want to see naked people. It's for the people." And he did it anyway, and it, that may have ended up costing him his job. I don't know, but he was always putting his foot in the water. But then they had another opening for the museum after that with William T. Wiley, where my dad and Wiley dressed up in cowboy outfits. Again, my dad always I always felt like he really kind of wanted to get into the artistic process. That's why he did the Tingley, and part of the reason he worked with Krista. So this was his one moment of performance art. So he and William T. Wiley dressed up in cowboy outfits, and they had little toy pistols, and they walked in, and they went up to the receptionist, and they took out their toy pistols, and they said, "Give us some art." And it was their moment, and then they had all the beat poets there, and all the, again, he loved that connection between different mediums, between the visual arts and the literary arts and the film arts,
And again, being very closely involved. I mean, you were talking earlier about how you like to bring things in from the outside, but nevertheless, there's also a very strong engagement, especially when he's in San Francisco, with the kind of local
with the community
of artists. I mean, the funk show, these are all kinds of art where one really wonders today whether it would have ever been given any attention without him kind of bringing...
funk is, but interestingly enough, I guess now, he just curated a show in Sonoma of William T. Wiley, who was one of the funk artists. And now there is, I don't know the name of it, but there's like this reinterest in funk. And there may be a show in Paris that my dad's running a catalog for. And then one of the major artists who were in the funk show was Bruce Connor, an assemblage artist from the assemblage show. And Bruce is now going to be the show that's inaugurating the new San Francisco Museum and coming to the Museum of Modern Art. And it's always fascinated to me, because I live in New York, it's like New Yorkers just like, they're so surprised when they see California art that was made 30 years ago.
Still today.
To them it's brand new. I mean, they're like, where did this come from?
It's interesting. I see a lot of parallels actually with what's happening, what has been happening in the last 10 to 15 years on campus here in terms of Chicago, because Chicago in many ways also has often been understood as a kind of secondary place for contemporary art. And there was such important art happening here in the 60s after your father had left, before as well. So, we recently had a show of Afro Cobra at the Logan Art Center, which really had never been given much attention. I'm thinking also of the Astor Gates' efforts now with the Arts and Public Life Initiative to kind of give local artists residencies. The kinds of things that we're trying to do today that really, your father was a kind of model for in some ways. Let's see. I'm wondering maybe we can transition a little bit, talking about sort of reflecting on his career in life, and what kind of lessons one can take from your father's life. You mentioned earlier there's quite a controversy around Reagan, the Board of Governors, difficulties with the university administration. I'm wondering about sort of failure. Your father has succeeded a lot, but there was that moment at the Guggenheim where...
There were things he did the Rothko trial. I mean, that was, his participating in the Rothko trial, which was very exciting for me as a child because I knew their kids. But my dad, and then after he testified, because he testified for Marvel, the other side, he was kind of vilified in the art world, but he has the ability, first of all, to persist. He has incredible persistence. Just like, he keeps going. He's as he says, I keep schlepping along. But he also has the ability to kind of spin a good picture of it, a good, flip it around and look at the benefits. So he didn't get, he had hoped to become the director of the Museum of Modern Art, but he at that point they had never given, at least on those major East Coast galleries, given it to a Jew, even a secular Jew. And although he won't go into that too much. And I think he was also too controversial a figure to have that kind of position. But then he found Berkeley, and so it was another door, so he went in that direction. So he was always willing to just try another door. If that one didn't work, this one will work. And to keep persisting. And I think that's one of the major lessons I've learned in my life from him, because I'm a writer, and you have some success here, and then other people shut doors to you, and you just have to keep going. And
one of the main ones that really I always remember is that he had made a lot of connections with Peggy Guggenheim.
Yes, and she didn't give.
And had really gotten very close to having her sign a contract that Berkeley would have a Guggenheim Museum in Venice because she wasn't allowed to have the artworks leave Italy. So his proposal was like, well, we'll just build a museum there. So the Guggenheim in Venice that we now have was going to be his Berkeley Museum in Venice. And it fell through in the very last moment. Do you want to talk about that?
He says that she apparently wrote a letter to him that she didn't trust Reagan because Reagan had yanked the budget at the last moment when he became governor, so she didn't trust Reagan. So he didn't get it. And he then proceeded to have to work with much smaller budget. But, you know, and there were moments, and I talk about this in my book too, where he had his doubts, where he then began to like look around for other places where he might land. But then, you know, he came back to, well, no, I really like it here, and I want to stay here, and I'm going to do what I can with this museum and this budget. And then he went and proceeded to overspend his budget. So he kind of just did what he wanted anyway, I would have to say. But yeah, I think that was a great disappointment too for him at that point. But then, you know, there's always another something else left to conquer, something else, something new on the horizon. And my dad is always in search of the next thing on the horizon. So he doesn't get too attached.
I would think that that's an incredible model to have.
It's an incredible model, but on the other hand, as a parent, you know, he didn't get too attached. You know, I mean, he had all these lives, you know, so there's a double side.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what it was like growing up in the shadow of this? You used that expression earlier.
I know, my dad was he was a big tree, he cast a big shadow. I think I was really enamored with my dad. He left when I was 7, and when he left, he took half like the art with him. And so it wasn't just my parent leaving, it was just a whole world vanishing, and a world that I didn't even really know I was part of until it disappeared. My mom was still part of it to a certain degree, but she was more of a writer. And we ended up down in this artist housing project called Westbeth, which was, again, very new place where it was a live work space for artists, and it was the oldest, it's now the oldest, and it was the original, basically an artist commune. And you know, Dion Artist was across the hall from us. But my dad always had the bigger life. He was pretty famous. He would blow into town, and you know, people would just, oh, you're Peter Selz. So that was really hard, and I actually had to find my way into that world. When I was 17, I went to California wanting to connect with my dad, wanting to enter into his world, and at some points I did, but it was really a struggle, and I think eventually I had to leave and, you know, find my own place in it. Writing the book was amazing, you know, because I could, in a way, I had control of the story. So yeah, it was hard. It was hard to also watch so many, because he loves something new and he loves new relationships. You know, I had to learn to watch so many people come and go, and then you know, you have to really hold your own. I did learn to hold my own with him. Sometimes.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
We want questions. Yes.
Question for you. You mentioned that Reagan was pulling funds for the museum. What are your thoughts about even in like elementary and high school, where when budgets get cut, arts are the first thing generally to get cut?
Yeah, and so my son was 17, and you know, they voted down the budget for his high school. They're taking out all the arts, and it's not a good situation.
I know that I spent some years on the school board, elementary school board, and the connection between, say, music and math is very strong.
Absolutely. You know, they had that online program. Yeah, for the little kids. Yeah, my son was part of that. Yeah, and even the visual arts. I mean, I went to high school in the late 1970s, and we were lucky at that point because our school was flooded with art programs. And writing programs and experimentation with the arts. And it's not in the public schools right now. It's not. I mean, you know, it's lost. So you have to supplement. I mean, I supplemented with my son, but it's not the same. And I was lucky I could supplement, right? I could bring my son into my dad's world, and I could bring him around to places. But yeah, and you don't see, and they, of course, your children, I mean, they want to do what their friends are doing. And if their friends aren't doing it, you know, it doesn't sink in the same way. But I think you have to expose your kids to it.
Can I connects nicely to the fact that the lab school is actually now building a big
Yeah,
arts wing,
I know, I saw that.
which is really sort of part of the broader arts efforts
So
of the
glad.
university now. And significantly, actually, just in the course of the downturn, the university decided to move ahead with the construction of the Logan Arts Center. It would have been very easy, I think, to not do that. It would have been an obvious decision, but forged ahead.
I
It is
found
now.
that when I would be doing something in the classroom, struggling in academic areas, say delayed readers or something like that, really would excel or really relax would be almost a better word when they were given an opportunity to play with art.
Right. Yeah, and y'all it's just learn one way. We're visible learners. Yeah, kids are really big. Yes.
Writing a memoir can be a terrible task. I mean, it's your family, and you're not just writing for your family.
Right.
I'm curious, I mean, this is a lovely book. What were the challenging organizational choices the structural choices for your book that you had to make in order to make it more than just my family memoir?
Right. I placed it in it's a 20th century art book. So every chapter has a work of art in it. There are images in it, and every chapter has a work of art that's discussed. I really want to talk about the culture that I grew up in, and how it was a radical time, and what that shift felt like. I wanted to make it a much bigger story. Did you read it? Or?
Yeah, no, I skimmed through it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just wondered. But so what it was like to be to move through that time period. It covers an enormous span for a memoir. I mean, it's not just my memoir. It's really starts in 1919 when my dad was born. And again, that was a pivotal point. That was the end of World War I, and that was the beginning. In 1910, if you date it by Kandinsky, that was the first abstract painting. So I wanted to talk about that whole moment when the world changed, and not just in, like I said in the film, but not just in terms of the visual world, but also in terms of like the dynamic of family life, which was sort of torn apart, especially in the 70s.
I was just curious if that was something that you had to strategize at the outset when you started.
I think that was organic to me because I felt it and I went through it. So I think it was a theme in my life, and it's a theme I struggled with, and it was something that certainly I thought about when I was having a child and raising a child, what kind of structure I wanted, and how, just being, I grew up with happenings and outrageous art happening all around me, and people, bleeding, they really didn't separate being an artist from being anything else, and so, yeah.
We're going to have to wrap up just because we're kind of hitting our time.
Oh, sorry.
But let's all thank Selz, Professor Howard, and Professor Mehring for giving us their time in this really amazing talk. My name is Jacqueline Todd. I'm a member of the Arts Alumni Network. I don't know if I need the microphone. It just doesn't seem like the greatest topic, so I'm going to just turn it off. But we're actually going to be having a cocktail, so if you want to ask more questions, you will be more than welcome to. They're going to be sticking around. They'll be right outside. It's co-hosted by the Arts Alumni Network and by U Chicago Careers in Journalism, Arts, and Media. UCIJAM, as it's called, is a new program designed to provide career support for students through innovative programming, internships, grants, and apprenticeships with leading practitioners in the fields. At the reception, you'll have a chance to meet with Ben Waltzer, there, who's the director of the program, and as well as Eric Hornick, who is the liaison to the Arts Alumni Network. The Arts Alumni Network is just over a year old and is rapidly growing, with organizations set up right now in New York, LA, and Chicago. And we have programming that has been going on all year in all the different fields of art. And is also a career and affinity group, and it serves as a professional network for those in the arts, culture, or entertainment fields. Following, you'll also have a chance to purchase Ms. Selz's book. Sorry.
Ms. Selz.
Selz. I've been having a really bad day with pronunciation.
Me too.
You'll be able to purchase Unstill Life, along with 2 other fascinating books by or about Peter Selz. In the upcoming weeks, you'll receive an email requesting feedback on this session and all the other Alumni Weekend events. Please take a chance to take a look at that if you can. And also have a wonderful day, and let's thank them again for doing this.
Thanks, Laura, and everybody who brought us here. Thank you too.